Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that's pretty complex, but at the same time, it's so relevant to all of us. It's how the endocannabinoid system, or ETS for short, is really a key player when it comes to regulating our metabolism, our appetite, and energy balance. Now we're going to zero in on what this means for obesity and metabolic disorders. And those are issues that are pretty much affecting a lot of people these days. Now, I know this might sound like we're about to get into some really heavy textbook stuff about cellular signaling pathways. And yeah, we're going to be touching on some intricate science. But you know us. We're always going to try to break it down so it's clear and engaging. So get ready. We're diving in.
All right. Sounds good to me. Where should we start?
Well, how about we kick things off with something fun? Did you know that the ECS wasn't actually discovered until the 1990s? It was Dr. Raphael Mechoulam's lab that made this groundbreaking discovery. I mean, isn't it mind-blowing that this whole system, which does so much in our bodies, was unknown for so long?
It really is. And it makes you wonder what else is out there just waiting to be discovered, right?
Absolutely.
The field is constantly evolving, you know? And that discovery of the ECS, it was a total game changer, especially when you think about how we understand how cannabinoids interact with our bodies.
Well, speaking of cannabinoids, do you think you could give us a quick recap of what exactly the ECS is?
Sure. So imagine the ECS as this internal communication system in your body. It's this network of receptors, enzymes, and neurotransmitters that are found all over. And it's working nonstop behind the scenes to keep everything balanced, like homeostasis, making sure everything from your mood to your metabolism is running smoothly.
So it's kind of like the body's air traffic control.
Yeah.
Making sure all the planes land safe and sound.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it. And like any control tower that's good at its job, the ECS needs clear communication channels. That's where those cannabinoid receptors come in, with CB1 and CB2 being the main players, so to speak.
Right. Those are the famous CB1 and CB2 receptors. We've all heard about those, especially with all the buzz around cannabis and its medicinal uses lately. But can you remind us what they actually do, those receptors, especially when we talk about metabolism?
So both of those receptors are important, but when it comes to metabolism, CB1 is really the star. It's heavily involved in regulating all sorts of things, like how much you eat, how your body stores fat, even how it processes sugar.
Wow, CB1 sounds like a busy receptor. So I know this is where we start getting into some really serious science. I've heard that CB1 receptors belong to this family called G protein-coupled receptors, or GPCRs for short. And they're involved in so many different cellular processes. But I've got to be honest, whenever I hear the words G protein-coupled receptors, I kind of zone out. Could you break down how they work in a way that even I can understand?
Okay, I'll give it a shot. Imagine that the CB1 receptor is a lock on the surface of a cell. And let's say THC, the psychoactive part of cannabis, is the key that fits that lock.
Okay, I can picture that. So what happens when THC unlocks that CB1 receptor?
That's when things get interesting. That's when the science really kicks in. The receptor changes shape. Scientists call this a conformational change. And that change, it triggers a whole chain reaction inside the cell.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah.
But at the molecular level.
Exactly. This cascade of events involves these things called G proteins, which are like messengers that relay signals within the cell. Specifically with CB1, the G protein involved is called gaios.
Gaios. That sounds pretty intimidating.
It's not as complicated as it sounds. Just think of this G protein as a team of 3 runners. You've got the alpha, beta, and gamma subunits all linked together.
Okay, so a relay team. I'm following. So what happens when the CB1 receptor is activated? Does it send those runners off on their mission?
Exactly. When THC binds, that alpha subunit grabs a little energy packet, which is called GTP, and then it detaches from the team. And that alpha subunit, with its GTP, can then go and interact with other molecules inside the cell, setting off a whole cascade of events.
So what kind of events are we talking about here? I mean, this is all happening on such a tiny scale. How does it translate into something we can actually feel or see in our bodies?
Well, that's the amazing part. This tiny molecular cascade eventually impacts processes like enzyme activity and gene expression. And believe it or not, those things control how our bodies use energy.
You're telling me that by just activating one receptor, we can actually influence how our bodies burn fat, or even make us crave a pizza. That's incredible.
It is, and it really highlights just how powerful the ECS is. It has a huge influence on all sorts of metabolic processes, everything from regulating our appetite to how we metabolize glucose and lipids.
Wow, okay, I'm hooked. So tell me more about how this tiny molecular cascade actually affects these major bodily functions.
Yeah.
What's the connection between those events happening at the cellular level and, say, me suddenly craving a bag of chips?
Well, let's dive into that next. So, welcome back to our deep dive into the ECS. Last time, we were talking about how activating those CB1 receptors triggers a whole chain reaction inside our cells, and ultimately it affects how our bodies use energy.
It's like we're uncovering the secret world operating right under our noses. Who knew so much was going on at such a tiny scale?
I know, right? And we're really just getting started. Today, let's explore how those microscopic actions actually translate into real-world experiences. Things like hunger, cravings, and even weight gain.
Perfect. That's exactly what I was curious about. Let's start with appetite. We've all experienced those munchies, especially after, consuming cannabis. Is that just the THC messing with our brains? Or is there a deeper connection to the ECS going on?
Oh, it's definitely not just in your head. THC is actually tapping into the same system that your body uses to regulate hunger naturally. Remember those CB1 receptors we talked about? Well, they're located all throughout your body, including in areas of the brain that control appetite, like the hypothalamus.
So when THC binds to those receptors, it's basically hijacking the system.
That's a great way to put it. THC is basically mimicking the effects of the body's own naturally produced cannabinoids, like a anandamide, for example, which signals to your body, hey, you're hungry, time to eat.
So it's like our body's natural way of making sure we get the energy we need. But when THC activates those receptors, it's like those hunger signals get sent into overdrive.
Exactly. And it's not just the hypothalamus that's involved. CB1 receptors are also found in the brain's reward centers, like the nucleus accumbens, which play a big role in those pleasurable feelings we associate with food.
So that's why certain foods, especially those high in fat and sugar, become even more irresistible when those CB1 receptors are activated.
Precisely. When those reward centers light up, it just amplifies the enjoyment we get from eating, making us crave those tasty treats even more.
So it's not just about physical hunger. It's about the whole psychological and emotional side of eating, too.
It's a complex interplay of factors, for sure, and the ECS is right at the center of it all.
This is so fascinating, but also kind of concerning. It makes you realize how easily these systems can be disrupted, especially with all the processed foods that are so readily available these days.
You're absolutely right. Our modern food environment can really throw the ECS off balance.
Okay, so we've talked about appetite, but I know the ECS also plays a role in how our bodies store and use energy, right?
Yeah.
What can you tell us about the connection between the ECS and things like glucose metabolism and fat storage?
You're right. The ECS doesn't just tell you to eat. It also influences how your body handles the fuel you take in. Think of insulin as a key that unlocks your cells to let sugar in for energy. Well, when CB1 is overactivated, it's like jamming that lock, making it harder for insulin to do its job. This can lead to higher blood sugar levels and potentially increase the risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
Wow, so messing with the ECS can have some serious consequences down the line. And what about fat storage? Does the ECS have a role in that too?
Absolutely. The ECS influences both how fat is stored and how it's broken down. It's like the ECS has a hand on the scale, tipping it towards fat storage when CB1 is activated. And let's be honest, it often seems to favor that abdominal area, right?
Oh, tell me about it. But the good news is that by understanding how these processes work, maybe we can find ways to tip the scales back in our favor.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the mechanisms at play so we can develop targeted strategies to restore that balance.
So we've talked about how the ECS influences appetite, glucose metabolism, and fat storage. But it doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? How does it interact with other systems in the body?
That's a great question. The ECS is like a master communicator, constantly interacting with other key players in the body, like the endocrine system, which regulates hormones, and even the immune system.
Okay, now you're really making my head spin. But tell me more. How does this communication work? What's the impact of these interactions?
Let's dive into that next. All right, so we're back for our final deep dive into this incredible world of the endocannabinoid system.
Wow, this has been quite the journey. We've gone from those tiny CB1 receptors all the way to real-life experiences like munchies and, well, belly fat. I never realized just how much was happening behind the scenes.
I know, right? And there's still so much more to uncover. But for today, we're going to switch gears a bit. We're going to explore how understanding the ECS might actually help us unlock some new therapies for some of the biggest health challenges we're facing today, especially obesity and metabolic disorders.
Okay, I'm all ears. We've talked about the downsides of an overactive ECS, but is there any way we can actually manipulate this system, like for therapeutic benefit?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And researchers are looking at a bunch of promising avenues. Remember those CB1 antagonists we talked about earlier, like rimonabant? Those were an attempt to block the CB1 receptors and basically put the brakes on an overactive ECS.
Yeah, but didn't those have some pretty bad side effects?
Mm-hmm.
What's the latest on that front? Are there any new CB1 antagonists being developed that might be safer?
Yeah, researchers are definitely working hard to refine that approach. One idea is to develop drugs that target very specific subtypes of CB1 receptors. Think of it like this. Instead of shutting down the entire communication network, we can just target specific channels. That way, we can minimize any disruptions in areas like mood and behavior, but still get those desired effects on metabolism.
So it's like finding that sweet spot,
Yeah.
dialing down the ECS's influence on things like appetite and fat storage, but without messing with our emotional well-being.
Exactly. And there's another interesting avenue that involves targeting those enzymes that break down endocannabinoids. Do you remember FAAH, the enzyme that breaks down anandamide?
Vaguely. Remind me, why would we want to mess with that enzyme?
Well, anandamide, that naturally occurring cannabinoid, has shown some really promising effects in preclinical studies, especially for things like anxiety and pain relief. By inhibiting FAAH, we could potentially boost the levels of anandamide in the body and harness those benefits. But without directly targeting those CB1 receptors.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like finding a back door to therapeutic benefit, bypassing some of those potential downsides of directly targeting those tricky CB1 receptors.
Precisely. And there's another enzyme called MAGL, which breaks down 2-AG. That's another key player in the ECS. Inhibiting MAGL could potentially increase 2-AG levels, and 2-AG has shown anti-inflammatory and neuroprotective effects.
So this could be a good way to treat conditions like multiple sclerosis or even Alzheimer's disease, where inflammation and neuronal damage are big problems.
Exactly. It's all about understanding those nuances of the ECS and finding those precise points where we can intervene and potentially lead to some real breakthroughs in treatment.
So we've got CB1 antagonists, enzyme inhibitors. Are there any other strategies being explored to manipulate the ECS?
You bet. There's a lot of interest in developing drugs that actually enhance endocannabinoid signaling. This could involve creating synthetic versions of anandamide and 2-AG that are more stable and have longer-lasting effects. Imagine being able to boost your body's natural endocannabinoid levels to achieve those therapeutic benefits.
So it's like giving the ECS a little boost, right?
Yeah.
Amplifying its natural ability to regulate and heal. I like it.
And then, of course, there's that whole exciting world of phytocannabinoids, the naturally occurring cannabinoids found in the cannabis plant.
Ah, yes. The famous CBD, THC, and all those other interesting compounds. What's the latest on their potential therapeutic benefits?
Research in that area is just exploding right now. There are promising findings coming out all the time. CBD, for example, has already gotten a lot of attention for its potential to treat epilepsy, anxiety, and inflammation.
And even THC, even though it has that reputation for getting people high, is being studied for its ability to relieve pain, nausea, and muscle spasms.
Exactly. The challenge is to really untangle that complex web of these compounds, their individual effects, and how they interact with the ECS. But with each new study, we're getting closer to understanding how to use their power for therapeutic benefit.
It's like we have this whole arsenal of tools at our disposal, and we're just figuring out how to use them effectively.
It's a really exciting time to be working in this field. And it's important to remember that everyone's ECS is unique. What works for one person might not work for another. So finding the right approach for each individual is going to be key.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from the inner workings of our cells to the potential for truly groundbreaking therapies.
It's amazing what we've learned about this remarkable system, and as research continues, I have no doubt that the ECS is going to unlock even more pathways to better health and well-being.
I couldn't agree more. Well, folks, that wraps up our deep dive into the endocannabinoid system. I hope you enjoyed the journey as much as we did. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm suddenly creating a big plate of nachos. Until next time, keep exploring.